Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you guys are here. Thank you guys for being here on live. Dr. Bauserman and I really appreciate you guys joining the sharing of what we kind of know, what our experience has brought us to about MTSS and so on. I hope some of you guys are, kind of sitting back in your seat, got some food going, some drink going, and just kind of relax and just kind of take all this in. Obviously, shoot us a chat box if you've got something that's pertinent to the conversation, and hopefully we can answer your questions. This is the second part of a four-part series. We're going to be focusing on problem identification and problem analysis within that MTSS framework. So obviously, we're going to be really zeroing in on those things that you guys need in order to, obviously satisfy that part of the MTSS framework. We know that problem identification and analysis is important. That's what we're going to be sharing over the next 45, 50 minutes. And hopefully you guys can find a nugget or two to take back to your schools and districts. So what we're going to be looking at too is reminding ourselves of the importance. It's our focus about why we're doing this in a multi-tier systems of support. It's the question that we ask, what do students need to be successful? The successful districts and schools that are doing this really well are able to really hone in on, focus in on, narrow in on exactly what the student needs to be successful. And again, that's where that equitable practice comes in place versus that equality practice. We don't need to do social skills development for every single child in the schools. Some of our kids come to schools with a very strong sense of social skill development. Some come to school with a very strong sense of how to function behaviorally in the class, and some come with a great sense of attributes on intellect, intelligence, skill sets, those kind of things. So again, in order for this to be efficient and effective, we've got to have this ability to be able to really focus in on what is truly going on with Johnny, Susie, Juan, Demetrius, Sahib, all those kind of kids that might have a issue that's going to prevent them from being successful. So that's the whole idea. So when someone says, why do MTSS, is because we are truly trying to find all those barriers to success so that we can apply the appropriate, and that's the key word, the appropriate intense intervention that fits the need. So that's, again, I wanted to remind us that's what we're going to be doing. We're also going to be thinking about on this webinar, two things. It's really looking at a process to identify students, and then how that's going to streamline into the process of interventions, which we'll talk about in webinar 3. But before we go on, we're going to go ahead and do a quick poll, and Sherry's going to go ahead and launch that. And then what we're going to want to see, again, I'm just going to kind of wait a few give you 30 seconds, 45 seconds to actually do that, and then we'll move on. Great feedback, yeah, and again, as you're finalizing your responses, I think it really tells on the effectiveness of building in these MTS frameworks, of being able to kind of assess where you guys are at. Hey, Doug, we really are at the defining stages of MTSS. We're moving away from our RTI language, our PBIS language, our whatever language you guys are doing, is saying we really want to build this MTS framework, but we need to be able to define it. But it looks like most people the bulk of the answers are centered around the implementation of the components, especially as we look at being able to do that with fidelity. That again is going to be what we really want to focus on, is not just implementing, but implementing with fidelity. So thank you guys very much. I'm not surprised that's kind of where we're at about the implementation. That's obviously why part of what you guys want to be here and so on. So that's what we're going to talk about, is really looking at, not only are we defining it, putting the steps in, but how do we get these to have a stronger implementation of what we're doing. So we'll talk about that as we go through. And again, looking at this idea of our components, again, not going to belabor this. We talked about this last webinar, but again, a reminder that in order for our MTSS implementation to work really well, efficiently and effectively with fidelity, we've got to make sure that we've got all these components in place so that our process does not stagnate. We don't have gaps in the process and so on. So obviously we understand that it's multi-tiered, but we know that we've got to have preventative, proactive, and interactive measures within our MTS framework. That's the whole idea, being able to say, this is how we're going to, create this foundation for success, whether it's academic, behavior, social, emotional, for all of our students. And then what we're going to be focused on today is really looking at how do we become a little more proactive. So this is that active part. So as a staff, we're going to start to do some screening. We're going to start looking at data so that we can identify those kids who are at different tiers. And once we're able to do that and really hone in on that, that's where the interventions become a lot more effective, because we understand they're more appropriate, that fits the level of need. And then, of course, don't forget our capacity for teachers to support this process, whether you're just giving teachers access, whether you're giving them some kind of direct instruction, or whether you're doing coaching, because we want to be able to differentiate PD just like we differentiate in the classroom. And then, of course, don't forget our parents, where we want to pull them into our process. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we have a clear set of how we problem solve those issues, and of course, ultimately making good database decisions. So again, and Dr. Bauserman, of these components, the districts that you work with, is there any on these components that you feel like, I think that a lot of them commonly lack any of these components?
I think it runs true to the survey. A lot of people are in that implementing, and that's a very difficult stage, and then they are evaluating. But once they get to the evaluating the effectiveness or whatever you're doing, look, a lot of times then you're going to have to go back to that second question, which is, what are the components? Are we really looking at what we need to be looking at in order to solve the problems that we're looking at? Yeah. So I think it's kind of a circular motion. You're going to get out there and say, I don't know if that's what we're doing, if that's really giving us what we need. So just remember that, 3 and 4 actually lead back to maybe 1 and 2 as you go through this process.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so because of that, obviously we're assuming, hey, we're as we're developing these components, today's really going to be about our zeroing in on that tier level of need. So how do we identify those problems that our district has, our schools have, our classrooms, our students, and how do we really understand the scope of that problem? That's going to require some analysis, but it's really going to require some tool sets. The tools that you guys acquire, you develop, you create, that's going to be up to you. We're just going to share some of the things that we've experienced. But again, we've got to be able to pause and say, hey, I know we purchased all these interventions, we purchased these behavioral programs, these social emotional programs, these academic programs, but and then we just start implementing them without really understanding what's the problem, and are we overly intervening, which that can easily become ineffective as well. So again, we want to be strategic, and that's what we're going to be talking about today and so on, which brings us to, I love this quote that talks about the significance of being able to really look at the problem. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So we know there's merit in pausing for that. The difficulty for schools is just think about where we're at now with COVID-19, with the civil unrest, with this political divide, the stress that everyone's going through right now. And then we're asking schools, hey, let's develop some MTSS structures. Let's start doing interventions when we really haven't paused to find out what's going on. How much of this stress that teachers are under, all educators, students, how much of that stress is going to manifest itself academically, behaviorally, and social emotionally? A lot of our schools that we're working with are pausing and saying, yeah, we know instruction is critical. We know that we feel like we've lost a year, 2 years of instruction, and everyone has this high anxiety, but we need to pause and say, where is the problem? What's manifesting in our kids today, and so that we can be really good at intervening. Maybe we need to require more social emotional development at this school, at this district, before we even talk about academics, or vice versa. Maybe our kids have responded really well. Maybe they're highly resilient, and we don't really need to spend a lot of time on social emotional development, that we could actually introduce these higher order thinking skills, these critical skills, changing our core curriculum and so on. So again, just taking the time to be able to say, what is the issue? And our framework, our visual that Dr. Bauserman and I really try to push is this idea that we're going to start with screening measures. Screening can come in many different forms. And it's also this idea that we want to make sure that we're addressing the whole child. It's a lot of times that we see schools and districts maybe focusing too much emphasis on one particular area. And maybe they do it because they've made an assessment, or maybe they do it because they think that's what their problem is. So we want to make sure that we're truly understanding what's going on academically, what's going on behaviorally, and what's going on social emotionally. And we all know on the call, if you've been in education long enough, those all feed into each other. One's not more important than other, but having a strong academic obviously is going to influence and impact how your kids behave and how they act and how they're able to have, different kinds of self-competencies and those kind of things. So that's really what we're going to want to see, is really some specifics about what that looks like.
Yeah, and Doug, in that area as well, is if you just kind of reflect, you and I have been in schools a long time and worked with schools a long time, and the people on the call are in schools, reflect back on how much time is spent on academic screening versus the other ones, and how people feel their confidence level as a teacher or an educator to academically screen someone, but behaviorally and social emotionally, they might not be as confident when it's more of a formal screening. But I also want to put out there to the group and let them kind of think about this is teachers and educators in the classroom are screening behaviorally and social emotionally all day long. Classroom management is truly screening of those behaviors in a consistent manner. And that's really the screening process. Was a formality like that is just trying to reaffirm things that you've already observed.
And you bring up a good point as we go through this today, is we've had this discussion with teams at the district levels and school levels to say, look, you guys really need to pause and say, what are you already doing in the classroom, at the school level, at the district level? Because some of the things that you're doing, you might not be defining as being proactive or fall under the MTSS umbrella, but they actually might be the best things you could do. So sometimes it's good just to go in and start defining what you're already doing. And it's important to label it, because it's easier to have it permeate and create a culture of intervention when you can put a label to it, put a vocabulary to it, and let all your teachers kind of buy into that. So a lot of good things that are going on with educators, but I think sometimes we just call them different things. So what we're going to talk about, two things. We're going to be looking at screeners and incident management. Both of these are ways to look at what these problems are in order for us to make those really good strategic decisions. We're going to talk about social emotional screeners, academic screeners, the other screeners. We have behavioral screeners that we've used, but I want to focus on now first, because Dr. Bauserman and I have a little bit of a niche or an overemphasis on behavior and social emotional, but we're very sensitive to the fact that, we know we have people on the call that are obviously wanting to put the academic structures in place, which is why we're going to talk about those as well. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the tiered level of need that we need to identify, and we're going to use the PBIS as a foundation. So obviously we're not going to go into what PBIS is, positive behavior intervention and support, 3-year model, being positive, proactive, and preventative. You guys can look at that. That's another webinar. But what we want to be able to do is say, where are our students at this level, so that we can apply those PBIS principles and tenets that allow us to work through those particular issues. So the first thing we're going to look at is just these are just examples. And it's not necessarily, oh, Doug, I've got to do that exactly. What it is you guys need to have that conversation of is, if we're truly trying to implement a MTSS structure, which is really a multi-tier structure, then we've got to have a process to be able to say, how are we really defining those tiers? And so looking at, incidents managed by location says, okay, where's the problem? And I don't want you to look necessarily as, oh, these are all different scenarios, but I've got to find a way to be able to quickly look at charts and reports and say, where is my tier level of support supposed to be? If I've got reds and oranges that are a lot smaller, then I know where they're at on the tier level. But if I've got these gross pieces of pie that are really struggling, whether it's arrival in hallways or arrivals in cafeteria, so now I've got some unstructured places that we really need to focus on. So again, it's the piece of, can you get to this place that says, hey, we really want to identify the problem? Because here's what I'm telling you. It's like Dr. Bauserman said, if you guys can get really good at operationalizing what is wrong, then your implementation becomes a lot more significant. Your efficacy of programs becomes a lot stronger, because you're actually applying it to a very specific area where it was meant to be. The problems we see with implementation is the schools apply it to all areas. And so they're getting a very surface implementation, and that implementation a lot of times is not very strong. So the schools and districts and classrooms and teachers that are able to really provide a specific definition of what's going on, they're the ones that are going to be able to see that list of intervention. Time of day, again, these are just examples from 360 software, behavioral software, that talks about, how we're able to disaggregate the data into a problem area. So we want to be able to look at and say, you know what, staff, you know what, Miss Johnson, Mr. Johnson, you know what, we've got these issues in the afternoon, or we've got these issues in the morning. So we're going to apply our multi-tier systems of interventions during these times of days that we know are the problem. Again, we're not going to apply it all day long. We don't need to. We only need to apply our intervention, and which makes for a stronger implementation on those areas that we've defined as a problem. Same with incidents by behavior. School districts that are able to say, and again, we've talked about this before, especially when hey, Doug, how do I know that my staff or my teachers or my district's teams, problem-solving team, how do they know that they really understand the problems at this school or district? Well, ask them. Say, what are the top 3 behaviors at this school? And if they're 10 answers, 15 answers, then you pretty much told yourself, we haven't elevated the problem identification at this staff. If you know that abusive language is the behavior that most incidents are written for, you can stop and say, wait a minute, what interventions are we going to do throughout the school that are going to be able to identify, having school language? How do we promote school language? And when you say that, then your interventions center around those top three. And then when you have parents come in the office or in the school, the moment they step on the campus, and you've got it written that we promote school language, again, the implementation goes through the roof because you guys are actually narrowing in on the problem. So again, it's not just, saying we got these great charts and reports that allows us to look at this scorecard, but it's if you want your implementation to go up and you want your multi-tier systems to be more effective, you just got to be able to look at those problems. This one's by grade. Again, Doug, I know Adam has, we both have done so many different kinds of consultations at the school levels. And it's really interesting to see, and this is what I'm amazed about, is when we look at the data for incident data, and they'll say, hey, last year, our 5th grade was really bad. And then I say, and I tell them, next year, I want you to tell me if your 6th grade is really bad. And most of the time it's like, yeah, 6th grade. I say, yeah. So is it the teachers or is it the students? Because I know when I taught, some years I had great, rosters, and some years I had a lot of kids that were struggling. So it's important to see that we've got this. Is this an environmental issue, or is this a student population that just requires more help, more interventions? So again, what are we asking ourselves to do this, and so on? And then the last one would be how we drill down to the student level. So now we've got this picture, this tier level support picture of what's happening at the granular level, what's happening in the middle, what's happening at the top. And now we can identify those students. Dr. Bauserman, tell me a little bit about how you approach districts and schools when you talk about the top 10.
Right. Yeah. And kind of thinking about this, especially when you get down to this level, is looking at kids who are habitual versus frequent versus may just fall in the normal. So when you go into a school and we talk a lot with them about, what does your behavior look like? And, we have so many incidents, and you run raw numbers and it says, we got, 150,000, however, with big schools or even with small schools, we have 1,000 incidents. Okay. Well, what kids account for those 1,000? You go in, it's not that you have 1,000 incidents and you have a school of 500, so everybody thinks, well, everybody gets 2. It's not that way. This report right here allows you to kind of hone in and focus, because you may have 10% of your kids causing 80% of your problems. And if we're just doing broad brush strokes, kind of Doug alluded to it earlier, then that's not going to help, because the kids who are already doing it, it doesn't mean anything to them. And the other ones, those broad brushes weren't working in the beginning. So you can really work your way down. I just call it kind of the habitual, frequent, normal risk for students. So this one is a big one. It's critical because you've got to kind of nail it down of where are we going to start. And I think, Doug, you said a lot about setting, Where is it happening? Well, we're going to do all this everywhere. Well, it doesn't happen here. So we need to focus here. We have issues in hallways. Okay, well, what is your hallway monitoring? Well, we just have people kind of here and there. No. If one person works in this hallway, that's great. In the other hallway, it's not working, then maybe you put 2 or 3, but you can still keep your 1 at the other one. That's we're trying to get a little more specificity to what's happening, so we're not just kind of broad brushing it, seeing it doesn't work, and then broad brushing it again. So yeah, that's a big one.
And that leads to how we're dealing with behavior, that the actionable steps that we believe based on the data. And again, like Adam said, we're screening all the times, formally and informally. We are trying to have all this data come in, whether it's anecdotal, whether it's something formal, that we want to be able to create these targeted areas. So school-wide, we're going to do this. classroom-wide, we see certain grades that have struggles with certain, maybe it's in the morning referrals. And then we've got these top 10, these habitual students that we really, really need to provide some tier 3 interventions, or maybe even some tier 2. So again, do we have a process that allows us to look at these targeted areas based on the way that we're capturing this data? That's the ultimate way. This is how it's going to identify the components that you guys promote. This is going to determine how well you implement those particular programs. I have worked with schools that are doing 3, 4, 5 behavioral programs simultaneously. And again, they're implementing 5 poorly instead of maybe adopting a unique one and doing it really well. So again, that's what's going to help, is if you guys are able to get those targeted areas, which leads into social emotional. Same thing, same kinds of concepts apply. Is we're trying to promote social emotional development, but we've got to be able to identify where those needs are at in order to apply those interventions. So this particular screener, this is the BAS Best 3 screener, which allows, and again, you know, Adam and I are very sensitive to budgets, to funding, to, you know, some people will use Google Forms, some will use, you know, just data on the wall. Some people will use these formal screeners. Whatever you use, and make it easy for yourself, is we've got to see this end data that allows us to say, you know what, we've got 27% of our kids who are at the risk level for this social emotional development. And so again, think about this for a moment. I know 20 years ago, working at the state level, you know, my job was to disseminate those things that really worked. And there were some wonderful social skills programs. But again, I think I've said this on the webinar before, is we were trying to apply social skills development everywhere. And what was happening is teachers were pushing back, and they're still pushing back, is I don't have time to stop and develop these social skill lessons. And then the counselors were like, look, we know how important this is. No one's debating the importance of it. It's logistically, it competes with so much of the instructional. So what we say is, this is the equalizer. Going in and screening and identifying your problem can equalize this workload that you're requiring teachers and counselors and social workers and psychologists and behavioral specialists. You know, we want to be able to offer social skills development, and it has to be an integral part of the day. And the only way that's implemented well is if you've got a very specific scorecard that allows you to program what's going on. I want to know that if Castle recommends their big 5, and these are 3 of the big 5, and I want to be able to say, we're just going to focus on self-awareness for this grade, for this student, for this district, you know, and that's where the implementation becomes really strong, when you can say, we're only going to do lesson plans based on the screener deficits. We're not going to do this in a general way where it becomes ineffective. So again, do we have a way to capture the data that allows us to see this data school-wide, classroom-wide, and individual-wide? Because again, if I can say that we really need to focus on 5th grade, and we know that 3rd grade does really well, that's going to give us, you know, a lot easier implementation effort when we know that it's being strategic. We want, and again, it's kind of like when you talk about teacher assistants or paraprofessionals, you know, those kind of ancillary people that support even behavior specialists, you know, being able to pull up the problem identifiers and to say, look, I'm going to spend my time in 5th grade the majority of the time because that's where they need the help. I'm not going to say 2 hours here, 2 hours here, 2 hours here, and then it becomes a equality instead of a equitable practice. So again, looking at this data at the global wide, and then being able to see this even as individual students, here's our kids. The kids in green are tier 1. The kids in yellow are tier 2. The kids in red are tier 3. So there's our MTSS identifier. This allows us to say, we're going to do targeted social skills groups for the yellow. We're going to do individual plans for the kids in red. And so again, being able to, again, whether you're using Google Forms, Microsoft Documents, or whether you're purchasing screeners like the Best 3 or the SSIS, SEL, whatever those are, we've got to get to a point where we're able to really isolate the problems so that we can implement strongly those kinds of interventions and so on. Adam, anything on the social emotional screeners?
No, just trying to find, as we said in the beginning, as we're going to say all the way through, is identifying those, and it's not guessing and it's not gut. You're going to have some hardcore, robust data that shows you these things, and however you get there, is varying for everyone. And there are some questions in the Q&A, and we'll kind of address those that lead into some of that conversation. But just having data in front of you to make those decisions in order to do what's best for either a group of kids that may all be on the same track and you can help them as a group, down to a student who is just going to need some intensive one-on-one individual type assistance. Right. But this concept of we're going to put it in, I think back to when I was a teacher and we go to professional development, and half the people in the room already knew how to do what the professional development was about. I mean, exactly. Why are they there? So, when I worked in a district, I said, let's just kind of send out a survey of what people need, and then they can pick. We'll kind of pick and help them pick which ones they could go to, because we want to build their skill sets. If they already have that skill set, I'm not going to belabor it and make them spend an hour in there. So same concept here.
That's the irony, Dr. Bauserman, is the importance that we put on differentiated instruction for our students, but sometimes we fail to differentiate instruction for our teachers. And I really hope that I think more and more schools might be adopting, the idea of personalized learning as again, it really increases the implementation,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is, again, as we look at the screener data, again, this helps us with our MTSS blueprint, our MTSS plan, however you want to call that, to say, okay, we've developed these targeted areas based on our screeners, based on the information we gather, to really hone in and identify those deficits, those gaps in our social emotional learning. And this is what we're going to do school-wide. This is what we're going to do classroom-wide. And this is how we're going to take those students that might have generated an elevated risk or an extremely elevated at risk. This is how we're going to tier those kids as well. So again, being able to format this into a blueprint for success is critical, which leads us to the academic part. So again, we know, the research is just so heavily supports the idea that where it starts is being able to identify research-based and evidence-based instruction. When we talk about reading, when we talk about math, when we talk about literature, when we talk about writing, when we talk about science and math and history and social studies and music and art, whatever subject we're talking about, what we all know is that there are ways to teach the instructional delivery, the best practice, the research best practices. Are we promoting those into the school-wide, district-wide, and so on? Are we sharing with teachers how to do that? Because again, we've got this litany of things that we do, and Dr. Bauserman said that. He said, we've really routinely been done well with identifying really good instruction. But again, are we able to have this granular look and really identify, we do benchmarks all the time. Now we're starting to see more and more schools and districts do what we call instructional screeners. That's what this is. This is AIMS Web Plus, and the ability to say, we're going to take a concept like numeracy composites, and we're going to break it down into some very specific math concepts. It's the same as our behavior and social emotional. And again, we want to be able to identify, what's happening school-wide, what's happening classroom-wide, and what's happening at the student level that allows us to really isolate what's going on. And again, a lot of times we've got teachers, pulling in a lot of kids unnecessarily. So again, some kids, and we'll end when we talk about how we deliver interventions. We'll talk more about it next webinar. But there's a real idea of thinking is we don't have to spend a lot of time sometimes with the intervention. Sometimes we do, but sometimes there's a max output that we want to look at that says providing 10 minutes of blank produces the maximum output for a student. And what we want to be able to say is how do we know that? Well, because we're identifying really the gap or the deficits so that we can turn that into a real strong implementation or intervention. And so again, as we work through that, we're going to do the same thing academically, that maybe this particular school has numeracy performance problems, gaps, deficits. Maybe grade 1 really needs to that's broken down into, we're going to have as a grade 1 level team really focus in on number comparisons, fluency pairs, those kind of things. And then of course at the granular student level, we're going to be looking at those students who are really, really at risk or below average in dealing with that numeracy performance. So whatever the target areas, I feel like, and Dr. Bauserman, you can echo that, is if you like, is about, I feel like we do a pretty good job academically with really looking at the benchmarks. We look at, different kinds of informal testing, formative testing, those kind of things. So I'm encouraged by that. I will say that if you guys are struggling with identifying academics and you're not doing screeners on top of benchmarking, I would encourage you to look into that.
Yeah, I'd agree 100%. And I think a lot of it comes through teacher training prep. They spend a majority of their time on academics because we know that's important, being able to write lesson plans, provide good instruction, differentiating the instruction, universal design. They talk a lot about that, but a lot of it's missed along the way of, classroom management is kind of on-the-job training. You'll figure it out once you get there. Hopefully you'll have a very strong student teacher that helps you with that and whatever it may be. And so we just got to kind of know going into that one, they may not have the skill sets previous to when they walk into your building, or maybe after several years in your building. But also, from what I hear from districts is teachers feel uncomfortable even screening students for behavior because of the pushback from parents or guardians or others that are involved in their life of, you're just trying to tell me my kid's a bad kid. They're okay with you telling them he can't read at first grade level. He reads at a first grade level and he's in the third grade. They understand that, and there's things that we can do to do that better, but it's tough to say, your student is showing, some signs of anxiety, and so what's wrong with my kid? They live in very different worlds, and I think they're treated very differently.
Well, and also, too, I think a concept is, I remember I recently took my car into the shop, and the mechanic comes back and says, hey, there's like 3 or 4 things wrong, and it's all computer generated. It's, you plug my car in and it tells you what's wrong with it. And I'm telling the guy, I say, well, then he's saying, it's going to be, $2,000. And I asked him straight up, I said, look, I want to know what I can fix to make the car run. Okay. I don't want it to be perfect because I can't afford perfect right now. And I don't even necessarily know if I need to put in a new part that's unnecessary. And I look at that sometimes about what schools are trying to do. I think sometimes we try to do so much that we don't ask ourselves, what can we do that's going to get that student to start feeling successful? And sometimes it's not near as much as we think it is. And remember, is the idea about these gaps, about these deficits, is we're trying to get our kids, our students, our teachers to fill in those gaps themselves. So I think a lot of times we've got to step back and say, we really need to identify what the true problem is, because, and this is what we're leading into with Dr. Bauserman and I, is that we're big we're big proponents of, okay, now we've got the problem, but what is the scope of the problem? And do we truly need to intervene 3 times a day, 3 times a week, for an hour, 30 minutes, 45? What do we truly need to do to intervene in order to start seeing a difference in the instructional environment and student achievement? And those are the key. I think what happens too is that we think implementation isn't working because we're really not looking at how well the instructional environment is, or how well the student is making achievement. I know a lot of times when I've consulted with teachers and I said, well, what's going on? Well, this kid's driving me nuts. Okay. What's he doing? Okay. Well, is that affecting the instructional environment? And you'd be surprised how many times the teacher would say, no, it's just irritating me. It's frustrating me. And then I say, well, do you think it's disrupting the student's achievement? Yes. So Johnny is affected by this behavior, but it doesn't affect the instructional environment. No. So sometimes we need to follow up when we start to identify these problems. We want to ask ourselves, what's the diff? You know, how long does this happen? How intense do we see this particular problem? You know, this kid does not turn in their homework. Okay, well, how often does he not turn in his homework? And when he turns it in, he doesn't turn it at all. He turns in half. He turns it in, but it's not written well. And then how often does that happen? So sometimes following up with the problem and trying to understand the scope of the problem can really drive your interventions. And again, we kept saying this, that what we want to be able to get to is a process that allows us to say, this is the problem. This is the impact the problem has on the instructional environment, the behavioral environment, the social emotional environment, and this is the problem that affects the student achievement. If the student is able to achieve what's necessary, the instructional environment is consistent, it hasn't been compromised, the integrity of the environment has not been compromised, then move on. That issue will work itself out. So I think sometimes we have to ask that and push back on our own selves and say, what's the diff for this problem? And is that problem going to be something that we can quickly intervene and let it work itself out? Or is that something we need to put on the actionable blueprint that says we need to address this head on, which is going to lead into identifying those evidence-based, research-based practices that we'll obviously talk about next webinar. But again, we're pretty convinced that we can see lots of implementation difference when we're able to really kind of understand the scope of the problem. Dr. Bauserman?
I'm just reminiscing and lamenting years ago when I first watched you or first met you and talked with you. Is I remember you asking this question, you know, what's the diff? And I thought to myself, what is this guy talking about? I mean, what's the diff? What is he trying to be, you know, whatever. And then when you went through it, you also always sometimes put at the end the S. What's the diff? The S being the setting. And that's kind of where he is showing you over on the side, you know, the instructional environment, you know, leading to student achievement is what the duration, the intensity, and the frequency of the behavior that's happening, but where else is it happening? And I almost brought it up when we were talking about location earlier on when we were running those reports of identifying that, because the setting is huge. The setting can tell you a lot of things. It may be the kid doesn't like the class. The students don't like the class. The students don't like the teacher. The teacher doesn't like the students. The teacher doesn't like the content they're teaching. It could be a lot of different things. You know, and me being a former math teacher in algebra in 7th grade, you can imagine, you know, you either have the high-flying kids that love it or you have the kids who absolutely hate it. And so I think the S, I like the diffs part as well, but it's shown over there. But yeah, this is one of my favorite, very simple thing to remember, but very powerful.
Okay, good. So that leads to is once we go through that process of asking ourselves what the diffs is that leads into, okay, Now we're going to lay in the foundation of how we intervene. And that's why what we're going to do for next webinar is really looking at how do we identify those tier levels of interventions that are going to allow us. Again, is the hard part is the level of need. There are so many different interventions out there that are really, really good. And what we have found is just what you guys said in the poll is it's a struggle. And we know that implementation is a struggle. So before we move into questions, I want to go ahead. We're going to do one last poll, and we're going to have Sherry go ahead and share that poll, and then we're going to debrief and process and answer questions. Sherry.
The poll has been sent. Thank you.
Yeah, starting. Yeah, not surprised, Dr. Bauserman. We're seeing mostly transitioning back to school.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a tough one. It is. It's so much effort, so much stress. Wow, I'm interesting to see academic, social, emotional, hand in hand. Not behavioral planning. Almost. I mean, it's almost nothing, Dr. Bauserman.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, I was noticing that, and they're starting to shift and change. And it's good to see that, the focus is transition, and they are thinking about academic, but the social emotional part is right there with the academic. So that's encouraging to see.
Yeah, as you guys do that. So again, thank you so much for participating in that poll. It's interesting. The snapshots, not surprising for the other schools and districts that we've worked with. We know that there's just it's just unprecedented where we're at. But again, we want to be able to focus on, providing interventions and so on. And so just FYI that our next webinar that Dr. Bosler and I will do will be November 13th. So that's just basically a month away. We'll talk about a continuum, looking at a continuum of evidence base, and then we'll talk about, again, how to monitor those things and to make sure that those have a strong efficacy for our school or district and so on. Okay, so we're going to end there, and we're just going to take some time because we got a little time left, is to really look at the chat line. I know that last time we did this, we had some wonderful, amazing questions. So, Dr. Bauserman, are you seeing anything in the chats or the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So. There is one from Edward, which I like, but I think we can kind of answer at the end because there's a story that goes along with me, and it's about, the lack of system to evaluate effectiveness and they see the same student going over and over and over again with the same things. We can talk about that, but this one is a good one. What do you recommend we use for behavior data collection that we can give to teachers and create a report using the teacher input? So, kind of ease of getting in the teacher's hands and then they're getting data spit back at them.
Yeah, mine is the choices are, I've got a budget, so I'm going to do things like Review 360 software. I don't have a budget, so I'm going to do some quick hard copies of data collection. I will say this, I do think there's other data collection softwares out there. What you want to look at is, like I know 360 does you can collect on the phone. I think that's why my wife's a teacher. She does Class Dojo. Right. She likes to be able to do it on the phone. But I think what I would invest in, if you've got a good budget, things like 360 software. If you don't and you have to use Google, there are ways to create confidentiality through Google Docs. It's just labor intensive. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It just knows that it's going to be labor intensive. But make it simple. And I think that's the key. What we found to implement is guiding teachers on what you want. It's kind of like behavioral incidents. The schools that have been successful that said we're going to collect behavioral incidents, but they give examples to teachers about the information that they need. So we need 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's what's submitted every time, and that's what allows the administrator to respond. So again, being able to kind of shape what you guys want on the data collection will really see a big push for a strong implementation. Simple, concise, clear, and then one last component of that is you guys have got to share that data. I talk to a lot of teachers who say, they're asking us to do this, but it's never shared. So if you want implementation to increase, sharing the data and showing the impact that the data analysis has will also increase your implementation as well. Great question.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the same thing. The next question, how can we help teachers collect, monitor behavioral data? That's going to be kind of a training thing. I know that's important, giving them the skill set of doing it because they're not used to it. But from my experience, they don't have much else going, so much going on throughout the day. And that's kind of what, Dr. Maraffa was talking about. If you have things like Dojo or some of those quick little information pieces, we work with, in Review 360. So, it's, you go over there and you do it. You got to think about, how many times a day are you taking this snapshot? Some people, it's varying in districts. That's all I can use is those examples. Some may do it 10 times a day. Some may do it 4 times a day. So 4 times a day, you're just trying to get a snapshot. So at least gives you an idea, is it worse in the morning versus right before lunch or after lunch or towards the end of the day? So there are different softwares out there, but it's going to be more of getting it in the hands of teachers and working them through that they're not trying to pinpoint some type of, disorder. They're trying to say this kid is showing some risk and they're starting to show these behaviors and we want to thwart those before they get too far down the road. So that's kind of the context you want to take.
And I like this one about this MTSS referral process, 504 special ed. What I have found working with schools is it's the analogy I use of someone like me that's doesn't exercise a lot, where I'm able to walk a mile in 12 minutes. Someone else can run a mile in 4 minutes. So knowing that maybe this person that runs a 4-minute mile doesn't really struggle with lifting weights, the more I can identify where people are at in their health-wise, whether it's academic health, social emotional health, the more precise you guys can get about where you think kids should be at each tier level, that's going to help with the referral process. That will help you guys know that I ought to be able to go to every one of my teachers on campus and say, hey, what does a tier 2 kid look like? What does a tier 3 kid like? And what does a kid that we're going to refer to special ed or 504 look like? They ought to be able to articulate what that is. And if they can't, then we as a problem-solving staff, we're not giving them that information. Master teachers know very well where kids are at. They know very well how long we're going to do an intervention, how we look at kids respond. So my advice is to get really clear that teachers are able to articulate where kids are at and what makes a kid a 504. Is it 50 accommodations? What truly makes a kid worthy of that 504 help, and can teachers articulate that? And if they can't, that seems like a training issue. So, I know, Adam, you've heard of those before. Just, when do we refer? When do we not? When's a kid a tier 3? That's where those processes have to be really, really explicit to shine that.
Yeah, and a lot of that takes into what are you doing prior to referring, and is it really valid, reliable? They've really had a lot of efficacy in how they're trying to do those. I hear a lot of schools that will say, well, they told me to collect data, I collected data, and now I'm sending for referral. I mean, that's really what the process is. My statement with the MTSS or RTI for academic or behavior, whatever terminology you're using, is that MTSS is the dam before special ed, not the bridge. We're not trying to do this so we can build a bridge and move them over. what people are doing within general ed settings may be completely reasonable, and it does show success and achievement. So that doesn't mean you stop doing what you're doing, but you don't need to move them on to somewhere else. You think it's going to be, greener pastures over there. Just know where you are within the system. And I think Dr. Maraffa said it best. You really have to define, what you're looking at. And a lot of them are very different. I don't think there's a one general blush we can say, we did 6 weeks, didn't work, you're moving. We did 6 weeks, it did work, you stay. I mean, I don't think that's going to be, because it may have just been the intervention you're using that wasn't working. You try something else. And that was a question that was coming up a couple times is, you notice that they're using the same interventions and they're not getting anything. So that's where adults just have to say, we need to stop. Okay, we're doing this intervention. We've done it for 2 years and it's not getting any better. So then why don't we switch gears? We have to be able to say that. And the only reason I was going to kind of keep it at the end is I was in that exact scenario from the question that came from our attendant person today. I went back, came into a district, looked at all the behavior plans, saw the success or, kids who were still struggling, and all of them pretty much had the same interventions. Even the ones that were struggling, they just kept them. And these were over 2, 3, 4 year periods. And it's always kind of a running joke that I say when I do training is you got to look at those. If it's not working, that's part of it. You have to evaluate the strategy. We forget that part. Just because the behavior is not getting better, it might not just be because the kid can't do it. It's because the way we're intervening is not successful for them. So that's kind of how I would address that one. But I'm getting a lot about, one was you were showing things up on the screen about social emotional. Where did those come from? So when you showed the SEL, Doug, that screener, where did that come from? What
yeah,
that
screenshot? So that's going to be the SSIS SEL screener. And then of course the BASC Best 3. Those are 2 that I would check out. I know there's others out there. Those are just the 2 that I have experience working with. So the SSIS SEL and then the BASC Best 3. But also too, I think that somebody made a great point about NASP. Recommending, not always relying on academic screeners. Could be an over-identification. Sometimes seeing how kids respond. That was the whole idea of responsible intervention, is to prevent kids from going into special ed unnecessarily, which parallels with being able to identify kids unnecessarily. So again, sometimes that's what I mean about simplicity. Sometimes providing a very simple intervention and see how kids respond could also tell you volumes about what happens. But remember that the whole use of screeners, it's not assessment. Screeners are a snapshot of we're talking about 20, 25 questions that allows us to quickly identify these students that might be at risk. We're not assessing them now. If we see kids that are in the red, we might say as a team, let's follow up with a true assessment. But like I said, there's lots of things you guys need to massage and figure out. But we will be there to help you. I know our time has ended, so hopefully we will be able to continue the conversation at our next webinar. Dr. Bauserman?
Yes, thank you for being here. I know there were several questions that we didn't answer. We'll try to go back and we can see those when a report is given to us, and we'll reach out. We can reach out to you, or if you want to just reach out to us with those specific questions, be happy to answer those. There were some really good comments in there, not really questions, but just comments about things that they're doing. So, and we appreciate those, because what we're really trying to do is we talk about what the districts we work with do, and if we can hear what you're doing, we all need to kind of pass it on to each other, especially in this time, in this age. So we're just here to support. And again, thank you for being here. I've enjoyed it.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Sherry.
Yes, thank you, Sherry.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.